Is gun control racist? It's a very interesting question because gun control actually has a history of deep seated racism. And actually, the earliest gun control legislation in the United States was following the end of the Civil War and during the Reconstruction era, where you had the Ku Klux Klan emerging as a terrorist organization. They were committing violence. Often they were hanging innocent African Americans because they simply did not want them to exist. They didn't want them to be free. And they wanted to make sure that, hey, even if slavery is not a legalized institution anymore, we're going to keep it going. We're going to make sure that the black people stay down and they have no chance of upward mobility. The governors and the state governments in these southern states were very complicit with the KKK. They supported everything that they were doing to the point that they started enacting gun control laws right around that time to make sure that African Americans stayed defenseless against these terrorists. As part of the Black Codes or Jim Crow laws, strict gun control laws were passed throughout the South, and they were specifically targeted against African Americans. Not white people. Oh, they could still have their guns, no problem. But yeah, no, we have a problem with black. It's like the same thing with voting. Oh, all of a sudden, all these literacy tests were introduced, but they only really applied to African Americans. So yeah, part of Jim Crow, part of the Black Codes, gun control was a huge component of that, but that's something you often do not hear about. It was done on purpose, though, so that they could not defend themselves against the KKK. But that was 150 years ago. That doesn't have anything to do with modern gun control policy, right? I'll give a more recent example then. How about the Mulford Act of 1967? That was actually a more recent thing, even though it was in the 1960s. It was during the civil rights movement, though, where you had the Black Panthers who were defending themselves against police brutality. They were defending their community because the police were out of control. They weren't just out of control, they were murdering innocent people who weren't doing anything wrong except be black. And they were murdered for it. And there was no accountability because they were hiding behind their shield. So they knew they weren't going to go to jail. Nothing was going to happen to them. So they got away with murder. The Black Panthers, they weren't going to tolerate that. They actually openly carried their gun, which was legal at the time in the state of California to have open carry. But what happened? Oh, as soon as all these black people started walking around open carrying, we can't have that now, can't we? So all of a sudden, the Mulford Act, one of the strictest gun control laws in the history of the United States, was passed. I wonder why that happened. No, yeah, it was to protect people. Protect people from black people. Protect white people from black people. That's, there is deep-rooted racism throughout almost the entire history of gun control, even if you go to the modern present day. Where are most of these gun control policies passed in this day and age? It's in inner cities. Mostly because it's Democrats that are in charge of the cities, and Democrats tend to support gun control. But who does it affect the most when these gun control laws are passed in these inner cities with heavy urban populations, a lot of African Americans? And that's, most of the gang violence that occurs and most of the death. African Americans are being killed the most in places like Chicago and all these other cities. But that's where you have these gun control laws. And it's like, I find it very strange how there are a lot of people that are so-called woke. And I honestly, that word is so overused at that point, I just cringed at even using that word, even though I used quotes, air quotes. But, people are so woke when it comes to deep-rooted racism, when it comes to institutionalized racism, when it comes to the history of racism in the United States, and all these things, should not be, we shouldn't be doing them anymore because of its racist history. But conveniently, when it comes to certain things, certain policies that Democrats want to pass, they'll act woke with everything else, but with gun control, oh no, we're going to ignore the racist history of gun control. With vaccines, we're going to ignore the Tuskegee experiments and how these new vaccines coming out disproportionately, they were tested on Black people, on African Americans, and there were some pretty disturbing things that were going on with those. We could say, oh, but the current vaccines are not like that. But there were a lot of African Americans that, rightfully so, even if there was no reason to be concerned, and I have my own thoughts about that, but we're not gonna talk about that because I might get canceled, I might get censored, whatever the hell. Like on YouTube, they're pretty bad with these kinds of things. But one thing that is true is that during the rollout of the COVID-19 vaccines, there were a lot of African Americans that did not trust it because of the racist history of vaccines being pushed to the African American community. It's not a very good history. So when the government was like, yeah, we don't care, you either take this, you take the jab, or you have no job, essentially. We will cancel your entire life if you do not take the vaccine. Thankfully, all that was kiboshed in the courts. But it's funny how African Americans were by far the ethnic group that was most against the vaccine and was most likely to not get vaccinated. And so any vaccine mandate, vaccine passport, whatever proposal was being introduced at the time, it would have disproportionately affected African Americans more than any other group, objectively speaking, because they were the ones that were most hesitant to take the vaccine. So it's funny how when it comes to things that they want to get through, whether it's vaccines, vaccine passports, or whether it's gun control, we'll ignore the racist history when it comes to those kinds of policies. We'll ignore that. But with other things, we're going to be like, yes, this is racist, that is racist. We love Black people. Black people are great. Please vote for us, Black people. But they're frauds and they're hypocrites because there are a lot of things that they support as a policy that have such deep-rooted racism that it's not even funny. So it's just some food for thought. If we're canceling everything that's racist now, why don't we start canceling gun control?